anticipating this event. There are no words to express our recognition and gratitude. This is just a certificate to make it clear that okay, we'll give floor to our MC. Okay, let's continue with our program. Let's resume our activities. And let's now talk about the economy of India in the 21st century, new socioeconomic policy, main economic activities, growth and development strategies by Juan Ignacio Martínez, who is a professor and researcher of the Center for International Relations of a national university, of which he was a director. He has published several books on international economics. The most recent is Stakeholders and Factors of International Economic Policy. He's the coordinator of a laboratory for analysis in international trade, in foreign trade. Thank you for your presence. One moment, please.
Van a checar, perdón. No sé qué quedarse media hora. Estaba dando a desear, pero ya está con nosotros. ¿No? Muchas gracias, licenciado.
Thank you. Juan Ignacio, we'll give you the floor. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I want to thank each and every one of you for your invitation. It's an honor to be here again and talking about the country, an economy, a society that gives a lot to speak about and of which we have a lot to learn and study. And I want to say hi to the professor from Colegio de Mexico. Nice to see you again. Now, let's look at the next slide. We have three items in the agenda for this session. One is an overview of the situation of India compared to Latin America and the Caribbean in the international economy. I'm talking about this situation, which is a point of attraction to us. I'll talk about the situation of the economy in this region in 2014 and 2015. And at the same time, I'll talk about Latin America. And then I'll talk about the trade relations between Mexico and India. And then I'll conclude with the situation regarding those exchange products. A little feedback on the commercial side. And then I'll talk about some conclusions. As we typically say in Mexico, in this national month, let's start, MC. So, let's start. On this point, let me talk about the situation of the economy of Latin America internationally. Next slide, please. One of the things that I believe is worth noting about this aspect has to do with the following. I'm talking about the behavior of India in the international trade scene. Something that draws my attention is the following. As I was preparing this slide, one of the things that caught my attention was the issue of the participation of India in international trade. The baseline year considered for this analysis is 1948. Starting in 1947, we saw the emergence of the GATT, the GATT, in the international scene, and the accounting or the financial year as a point of reference or as a starting point precisely is 1948 with the emergence of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade Tariffs. What was the situation of India in that year? You can see the participation of India, this country, in international trade. 2.2. That's a percentage of trade they represented. Just to illustrate the point, I'm not including China here, but China participated or accounted for 0.9% of the economy. The same applied to Mexico. But let's look at the situation of Brazil and Argentina. We're talking about the three Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, that stand out in international trade for that year. If you look at it from that standpoint, India had only accounted for 2% of international trade, only above Latin American countries. Let's look at 2012. 1.6, 1.405, 2.1, respectively in that order, with India, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. That's the order. Which means that India has an active participation in international trade. Next one, please. I mean, all these same data are plotted like this. You can see the participation, in this case, of our host country, which is the red line. Excuse me, that's India, not the host country, but the country in question. Red represents India. And you know that we had a crisis in 1972, 1973 as a result of oil prices. There was a significant drop in international trade, but starting in 1973, India began showing very active participation in the international scene. And this was a result of what? Well, it was the result of an endogenous and local factor applying to India, which is the participation of the state in a particular branch, which is that of science and research. That's where India has a significant level of participation. And compared to these countries, we can see that India has a significant growth, a more dynamic growth. Something that draws our attention is precisely the side of Mexico, but Mexico experienced growth as a result of its closeness to the U.S. economy, while India by itself, as a result of these investments made by its government in the domestic market, in this endogenous market, they achieved more. We need to bear in mind that you have the demand and the supply in the domestic market. You have two sides to it. India grew a lot as a result of this, of its supply market, what it offered internally, not what it purchased. And that establishes a point of comparison against Mexico. The next one, please. Let me just refer to these same countries. But here we have a selection of different countries whose economy is significant internationally. India didn't experience that significant drop compared to Latin American countries in the same periods. if we consider that Latin American countries grew as a result of debt and more debt, while India grew, and let me emphasize this, as a result of the injection of money or funds in research, science, and technology. Something that draws our attention is precisely in investments in these areas, which is now one of their strengths under this relationship we have with Latin America. The next one, please. So, what's the composition of imports for these countries? Well, again, something that draws our attention is the case of India. Considering what they purchase or buy from the outside, from other countries. In other words, their purchases, like they say in my hometown, from the outside. These purchases done in foreign countries have to do with products into significant sectors in the international economy. I'm talking about primary and secondary market products, extractive products, and manufactured or semi-manufactured products. That's where we find a significant area of opportunity from a standpoint of what we can sell to India. If we look at it from an international trade perspective. Next one, please. If you look at the analysis of what India buys and sells, you will find that India is ranked among the top 20 exporting countries, considering or taking into consideration the fact that in the early part of the century, India had a significant participation in the area of sale of manufactured goods and services. In the case of manufactured goods, we're talking about software, for example, and in the case of services, we have telecoms and telecommunication services. Something else that is interesting is a business factor in India that nobody has taken advantage of in Latin America except for our country. Mexico is only starting, but only as a result of migration effect. I'm talking about the so-called call centers. India has a lot of call center services provided to most of the largest companies in the world because of time zones. The only other country in Latin America that does that is Costa Rica. Mexico is only starting, but not as a result of an endogenous factor, but rather as an exogenous reason or factor. What we are seeing is the return of many Mexican illegal migrants that are coming back from the U.S. that don't fit or don't find a place in Mexico. They were born in the U.S., but they don't have legal papers, especially in the area of Zapopan. We began seeing the emergence of a Mexican Silicon Valley, quote unquote. In Zapopan, you will find many of these Mexicans who have returned from the U.S. now working with for call centers. That's why I'm talking about the fact that this is not the result of an effort made by the Mexican government, unlike Costa Rica, for example, the time zone. For example, if you call an 800 or 900 number internationally, if you pay attention to the voice of those who are on the other end of the line, you will find that they may be residing in Costa Rica or in India and still speaking Spanish or speaking English. So that's one of the aspects related to services that are now playing a role. In the case of software, we're talking about the know-how. That's where we find the best, or some of the best results India has achieved as a result of their investments in science and technology, as well as research. Whereas in Brazil, they're more focused on hardware. In India, we find the focus on software. Mexico is also a strong competitor in this arena. Why do I emphasize the software side? Well, we're talking about the side of knowledge. You'll know well that we cannot use a program without a license. If you don't buy the program as CD, you don't get the license to use that piece of software. That's what under international law, according to the World Organization of Industrial Property, we can apply through the Madrid Agreement, which is now the official standard for registration of trademarks, excuse me. We're talking about intellectual property, and that's where we find another niche of opportunity in India when it comes to international trade. Next one, please. If you look at India, or if you consider India as an important country in exports, well, that pales in comparison compared to its purchasing side. As a seller, it ranks 19. As a buyer, it ranks among the top 10. I mean, they buy as much as they sell. And where am I going with this? I'm encouraging you to look at India from the perspective of sellers, in the sense that India is a country that is increasing its purchasing power. And that's an aspect under which we should look at India. There is an area in the international economic scene, which is the GDP. Many talk about this variable, but what's the GDP? The gross domestic product. Well, we always say that such and such country will grow at such a rate, or the behavior of an economy reduced its dynamism, and therefore it has such and such decline in terms of its GDP. Well, this significant variable involves four components. I'm talking about investment, consumption, expenditure, and exports, parentheses, minus imports, which is known as the commercial coefficient of GDP. But if you exclude exports, you need to see India from a standpoint of international trade as a buyer, in the sense that it purchases, consumes, and spends in its domestic market. Therefore, since it is improving or increasing its purchasing power, in India, they are buying and selling with a great dynamism, unlike past years. That's the perspective under which I encourage you to look at India. Again, if you exclude investments, because you may say, even though you may say, no, we shouldn't exclude investment. That's correct, I understand that. But when a company invests, they invest because they will sell, they will produce. And when they invest, and produce, that company will generate the multiplying effect on the side of expenditure and consumption, because they will produce, and therefore we will have more jobs. And here, let me just make a reference to two aspects. I want to get into your field of expertise, because you're the think tanks in this. But you'll know that if there is production, there is consumption, and then taxes will be paid. And if that production generates employment or creates jobs, then that means more taxes will be paid. Well, that's what's happening in India from a standpoint of investment, consumption, and expenditure. If you consider that under the light of the other variable, which is exports, well, that's what India is all about today. I'm talking about the other dynamic economy in the world, because together with China, India is leading the charts in the region. This is only for you to have a better understanding of trade balance, imports versus exports in the Asian market, in the market of reference in particular, which is India. Next one, please. Let's look at what I said about services provided out of India. In this decade, there are two countries, two emerging countries that are giving a lot to speak about in services, Brazil and India. In the case of India, we will find these improvements or these achievements in the area of software and call centers. In the case of Brazil, we will find these services mainly in the aeronautic industry, because where was Embra 15 years ago? Where was Petrobras 15 years ago? Now, in the first week of October, in these upcoming elections in Brazil, that's exactly what people are discussing and debating. I'm talking about political parties aspiring to take over the government. And from a standpoint of consumption in that market, as a result of a decline in the exogenous activity compared to what we have in India, where consumption in that market is growing or grew as a result of this coexistence between the domestic market, the supply vis-a-vis exports. That's where we find the key aspect to analyze when it comes to India. What do we have on the service side, on the services side? Well, we have a significant injection or participation on the side of government in the fields or in the areas of science, technology, and research. If there is a crisis in the market, the first thing we will find is that companies will withdraw their investments in fixed gross capital and human capital. In Mexico, as a result of the 2008 crisis, one of the Mexican states far north, specifically the state of Chihuahua, for 10 years, they grew gradually as a result of investments in the maquila industry for exports. But in 2008 and 2009, the Mexican state that experienced the most significant drop in its activity was the state of Chihuahua. Why? Because these maquila or inbound assembly plants withdrew their investments in equipment and machinery. I apologize for this rough example, but if you look at India, of course, like any other country participating in international trade scene, of course they were affected by the decline in the economy of the U.S., with one exception, because this slowdown was avoided thanks to their investments in science, research, and technology. Why? Because that investment is an investment into their future, and that's where I believe there is a big difference. Because the difference is not the result of luck, but of planning, and that's where India is betting heavily on the future by investing in science, technology, and research. That's a pretty good comment. His question is how long it took India to get there. Well, it was a mid and long-term project. Let me comment or make reference to something a representative of Indian embassy said here in Mexico. He said, look, I don't understand why in Mexico the second language is not English. In India, for example, he said, thanks to this historic relationship with the UK, they have it as a second language. Now, that's one first thing. And then the other thing is that despite the different governments in India, one typical characteristic of governments, regardless of their political party, is this continuous investment in science and technology. To respond to your question, we're talking about a process or a period of 20-25 years. I mean, beginning in the late 70s, and the last decade of the 20th century, that's where you can find that investments or those investments in science and technology in India. The results are here today. Something else is that they did not overlook the domestic or the foreign sides. Let me explain. India not only became, and I apologize for the expression, they not only became the thinking mind of cyber technology, they also became the largest pharmaceutical laboratory in the world. Just like we say that China is a world manufacturer of drugs, they became the biggest pharmaceutical lab. Let me mention two aspects. One, I say this because they began attracting pharmaceutical transnational companies so they could come to India. And number two, they made a heavy investment in the education or training of human resources in the areas of health and research. And number three, the creation of a labor sector or a labor force for that sector. But it's not only for the so-called transnational companies, but for the creation of local or establishment of local companies that will become suppliers or vendors for that pharmaceutical industry. That's where the secret lies. And going back to this question, and to respond directly to your question, it took him about 20-25 years to achieve this result. Next one, please. That's where you find this added value in China, but I think he meant India. And as a matter of fact, some of our colleagues are here reaping the benefits of this technological development by using WhatsApp. Let's look at the participation of India in this trade of services. Let me emphasize it again. I mean, to say it in plain terms, we're talking about primary, extractive, secondary, manufactured goods and services, the intangible side of the economy. That's what we're talking about. I'm talking about processes, the think tank of companies. I mean, what you offer. I mean, we typically call it the firm, accounting firm mechanism. We're talking about consulting, guidance around interesting facts, and specifically how to tell the company from an accounting or a tax standpoint or an auditing standpoint what they need to do. The accountant for a given company may know what the company needs to do, but needs to have the expert opinion of each and all of you so that the company reports what they have to report. I mean, figuratively speaking, that's what services are all about. If you go to India, it's important to understand how they participate in the international services trade. Here you have it. When it comes to importers, for example, if we speak about the importers, it ranks number 7. Next one, please. And if you consider the specific weight of the services market, in particular in India, generally speaking, we can say that they account for 320 $260 billion. That's what their market represents. That's the size of the services market in India. I'm talking about technology. And my question then would be, what about the accounting side, the auditing side, and talking about good practices? If we go back to the ABC on good practices by Pricewaterhouse, or what, that's where we find a significant asset. If you consider what you do and can do in the Indian market. I mean, talking about this globalization, I would ask, what's the situation of tax accounting market in India? What can pharmaceutical companies can do in Brazil, Germany, and India, or in Switzerland, or Latin America and India, or talking about services provided by call centers for auditing purposes. That's where you need to consider India. I'm talking about the market of services. Next one, please. Another important aspect to analyze or to consider in the Indian market is direct foreign investments. We cannot analyze the automotive industry. We cannot analyze the pharmaceutical industry. We cannot analyze the call center industry without the participation of direct foreign investment. India, according to the UNTAD, plays a significant role in attracting capitals. In this regard, by 2012, which is the latest report we have, and by the way, here the titles of indices released by international organizations tend to be deceiving. The title of UNCTAD says a general overview of the economy in 2013, even though they're actually releasing data of 2012 or 2011. If we consider 2011, 2012, according to UNCTAD, in 2012, India attracted $65 billion. This is what India offered, $65 billion. And I just mentioned it for you to consider the magnitude of the amount. For that same year, Mexico only attracted 9 million euros. Or in the historic 10-year period, in 1 year, India attracted what Mexico attracted in 10 years. This is something for you to consider. If we consider 2015 and 2019, between 2015 and 2019, forecasts say that as a result of recent reforms, Mexico will attract $25 billion. Look at the magnitude compared to India. And again, let me ask, what can we offer India from an accounting and fiscal standpoint so that companies that are opening or starting in that market can get our services? Because most of them have an obligation I'm sorry, I forgot the name of this mechanism. The so-called ventanilla única in Spanish, or literally a one-stop shop. I mean, they have to fulfill this obligation having to do with their treasuries. So these companies, the question would be for these companies, what services do they need from a treasury standpoint, from an accounting and fiscal standpoint, considering that India is also a significant magnet when it comes to services. Let's look at, this is actually the same figures, but a different representation. Now, on the other hand, India. Let's look at India as an investment market. That's what we mentioned, but let's look at it differently. India, and I don't find it here. I mean, the point is that Mexico and Chile, which are the ones more visible in UNCTAD, they invest out of their country $21 billion respectively. I apologize, but for some reason I didn't include India. Next one, please. I don't know if it's in next slide. I'm sorry about that. I cannot see it, but something happened in this slide. Next one, please. Now, what's the status of a commercial or the trade relationship from a standpoint of products between India and Latin America and the Caribbean? Next one, please. Let me call your attention to two significant aspects that have to do with what Latin America and India have in the form of a commercial or trade relationship. Our subcontinent mostly offers primary products or goods, while India offers us products from the manufacturing sector. By the way, speaking of Brazil, one of the factors that led to their downfall, of course, was the primary sector. And we're talking about two countries that influenced the slowdown in Brazil, China and India, as a result of this behavior in the market of commodities. Now, which are the countries that are partnering with India? Well, one of them is Venezuela. Of course, we know what Venezuela has to offer India: oil, and the same applies to Mexico. The rest of the countries are mostly extractive companies. We're talking about extractive mining activities in the primary sector: Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, and the Bahamas. We're talking about India's partner countries. Next one, please. The countries with the relationship from the standpoint of imports from India include the following. Of course, we have Mexico, number 2. Then we have Brazil, Bahamas, Chile, Peru, Argentina, etc. But let me draw your attention to this side. The strong relationship in the area of extractive products vis-a-vis or versus manufactured goods. And let me make a comment. In these years of investment in science and technology, in the case of India, we see this added value. While in the primary sector, there is an added value. In the case of added value, we have more of it in India compared to the set or group of the Latin American countries. Next one, please. What do we sell? What do we sell them? What do we sell India? I typically don't like to read a lot of information, not especially when I'm doing my presentations. I prefer to use graphs. If I include text, I don't like to read what's on the slides. I am more visual. So I would say that what we have here is mostly, or are mostly, products from the primary sector. I mean, it's not that they're not important in my opinion, but they are not representative from the standpoint of technological added values or added value for the economies. I mean, when it comes to the commodity side, of course, they have a significant weight. Many economies have a great importance internationally as a result of this sector. But what is more significant or represents a bigger weight when it comes to comparing our markets against that of India? Let me refer you to the last 4 items on this slide. That's where we find the added value. And what we have here? Precisely a strong relationship between Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela. And Colombia, of course. That's where we find that relationship between Latin America versus India. Next one, please. What do we buy from India? Based on the trade map, what we find is the following. We have also a significant relationship between agricultural products or primary products, but basically secondary activity products, and that's where in both sectors we find a relationship, intra-company relationship with these businesses. What are the most important ones? I would divide that into 4 large groups or sectors: automotive, chemical products, pharmacochemical products, and electronics. So again, and this will lead me to my conclusions, let me ask the big question. Where is that big area of opportunity for you? Well, you need to understand, and I'm fully convinced that you all know of it, we need to understand the accounting, fiscal, and auditing practices of large corporations or companies compared to what we have as part of this commercial services trade relationship between our subcontinent and India. That's why it was great to choose this topic because we need to understand this behavior in India. Next one, please. Now, this leads me to my conclusions. And I truly hope that I am not getting into the next presentation, but where is that relationship that we have with India? If we look at the trade balance, I wouldn't say that it is there that we are weak. It's exactly the opposite. It's in the trade balance area where we have a large opportunity. Again, because of our consumption side, there is an indicator that has been barely explored, especially by the World Bank. The IMF, for example, talks a lot about the GDP, but they speak very little about the purchasing power index of the economies, which is the actual or the real indicator to determine the behavior. This indicator, it takes 4 or 5 years to develop these indicators, and for them to be released, once they follow the methodology, it takes an additional 2 years. So the most recent indicator by the World Bank is that of 2011. It was released last April. If you look at the Davos Economic Forum indicators, we're only talking about perceptions. I don't know if you have had the chance to participate, fill out the questionnaire, for example, about the competitiveness index for Davos, which was released 2 years ago. Well, that information, with all due respect, and I'm not saying it's not worth it, it's simply a questionnaire, because the questionnaire says, what do you think about it? How do you see it? And there are 2 international indicators that are more rigorous from a scientific standpoint. The CAN by ECLAC on competitiveness, and that on parity perception by the World Bank. Well, on this consumption and perception in India, something that draws our attention is the side of consumption and expenditure in India as a result of this strengthening of their domestic market in the light of the international economy, where we find that the main partner for India in Latin America is Venezuela. It is true. It has to do with the extractive or mining products, but there's another opportunity, especially now that the energy sector worldwide is playing a different role. But let's look at those countries with the highest or an average level of participation. We're talking about Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. case of the Caribbean in particular, we have a tourist industry, and then we have extractive or mining industry in Peru and Chile, and Argentina on the primary side. Next one, please. If we look at all of this from a production standpoint, considering the tariff categories, we will find that when it comes to imports into India from Latin America, a significant portion is here at the bottom. What we buy from India is at the top. This is where we have this relationship with that added value, with the extractive industry, which leads us to think in commodities. Now, if we consider them by weight or percentage, we will find that the sector or the areas where imports are higher are these. Let me just point out 2 or 3 exports. Motorcycles, which they buy from Colombia, thread, shirts from Panama, cathorocydic compounds from Brazil, copper from Chile, which is something they sell. But again, I'm talking about this commercial trade relationship. Now the question is, what is the importance of intra-company trade, intra-corporation trade compared to the activity between countries? Let me explain it. What's the weight of domestic companies compared to transnational companies? I want to get stuck on these dark transnational companies. No, I'm talking about the relationship between headquarters and branches. My question is if this increase in the trade is a result of the decision in Bonn or in Sao Paulo or in Santiago de Chile, or is it a long-term scheme led by governments, which is something that we should consider. Next one, please. And by way of conclusion, I want to mention the following. Let's not overlook the importance of the Indian economy, because it's a society that has invested a lot in its domestic market, especially in knowledge. There are 2 countries that have high levels of knowledge export, and one of them is India, globally. And it's not only about knowledge in the pharmaceutical industry. If you analyze the directories of international organizations, you won't find a single one of them that has in their top decision levels either people born in India or people residing in India but of Indian origin. And this is the result of 2 things. One, their culture. They're cosmopolitan. And number 2, of course, the adoption of English as a second language. And number 3, knowledge. In these countries, to enroll in a university, you need to overcome a lot of challenges. It's not like in Mexico. It's easier to go to high school here and then have their pass to a college or university. The difference is not their dream. The difference lies in planning. And India is a society where long-term plans are often made. Thank you.
Vamos a agradecer al licenciado Martínez su participación y le vamos a pedir al contador.
We're going to ask accountant Ruben Papa to present a certificate to Mr. Martinez. Well, this is a certificate to recognize your contribution to this event so we can get closer to India. Thank you.